The application of the LNT hypothesis has caused an irrational fear of radiation in the populace, and the observable effects of the fear of radiation from pushing this hypothesis or this extrapolation is significantly greater than the effects of anything these low doses of radiation could do. The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm pulling together a few strings of research to explore what I've learned from the experts on the linear no threshold extrapolation. The LNT model, as it's called, is based on the idea that all exposure to ionizing radiation is harmful, regardless of how low the dose is, and that the effect is cumulative over your lifetime. Now, this model is used to extrapolate the expected number of extra deaths that are caused by exposure to environmental radiation, and therefore has a great impact on public policy, especially concerning nuclear power. This, what we would call a precautionary extrapolation, is the reason that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has adopted what's called the ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable, in setting radiation safety limits. In some cases, these limits are set well below the levels of the natural background radiation that we all experience in our day-to-day lives. And that has a huge impact on the nuclear industry. When the doses are very low, the LNT model predicts the number of deaths from chronic exposures from environmental radiation sources via extrapolation from data sets where we know people have got cancer, like, for example, the cohort study of people that were exposed to radiation from the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan. So these sudden, large radiation doses. We know how many cancers are caused at various levels because we can look at the exposure of these individuals and track them over their lives. And they're still tracking these people and trying to measure the excess number of deaths that they have over the rest of the population and correlate it to the exposure that they got in the millisecond of the bombs going off. And then we're trying to use this to predict chronic exposure cancers at levels very close to the background. Why is this not a settled issue by now? Why is the LNT still contentious? It's because cancer is very common in society and people. 40% of people roughly will get cancer over their lifetimes. And our DNA is constantly being challenged by all sorts of mutagens in our environment, all sorts of toxins, alcohol, smoke, sunlight. All of these things contribute to our levels of cancer. And to tease out which of these exposures may have caused a particular cancer requires huge numbers of people at the lower levels, just from the statistics of it. And you can go back to my statistics podcast to find out why that is so difficult to determine. These radiation precautions have led to sunlight being listed as a carcinogen at all sun exposure rates due to the ultraviolet component of sunlight, which is also an ionizing radiation source, just like nuclear radiation, with no safe level of sunlight being suggested following the precautionary model. At the extremely low levels of radiation, we're talking about people who spend more time outdoors are more at risk of cancer. People who drink alcohol infrequently or are exposed to secondhand smoke need to be controlled for in your experiment. People who might be exposed to particulates from fossil fuel pollution need to be corrected for before one can tease out any sort of an effect from low doses of radiation. As always, if you like what you hear on my podcast, please hit like on your podcast app, share it with your friends. We'd also love to hear from you on the Rational View Facebook group. Let me know how you like this new format. I'm going to be taking some clips from previous interviews to try and summarize the expert opinion on this. Dr. Jerry Thomas will be the first clip. She's a professor of molecular pathology at Imperial College of London and an expert on the molecular biology of thyroid cancer. She established the Chernobyl Tissue Bank in 1998 and is an author of a number of reviews on the health effects of radiation exposure following nuclear accidents. Here's her introduction to the effects of ionizing radiation.
People think that ionizing radiation is something that only comes from a man-made operation, but actually that's not true. If you live on this earth, you are surrounded by ionizing radiation. You can't avoid it. There are isotopes that are present in the food that we eat, in the water that we drink, and also in the air that we breathe, because if you live in an area where there's a large amount of granite, for example, you get a lot of radon gas, which seeps up from the ground. So you just cannot avoid radiation if you live on this planet. People, are under the impression that things like uranium are something that only comes from the nuclear power industry or from nuclear bombs. But actually, uranium is present in seawater. So every time you go for a swim in the sea, you're exposing yourself to uranium. Small amounts, but it's still there. And I think this is part of the issue that we have, is people think that exposure, no matter what the dose, is what causes the problem. But actually, we know from every toxin that we're exposed to, that there is a dose response curve for every single toxin. And for radiation, it's believed to be a straight line. There are arguments over whether it really is a straight line or whether there is a threshold above which we only see reactions and health effects. But it's no different from any other toxin to which we're exposed. And actually, we know an awful lot more about radiation than we do some of the chemical toxins, for example. And it's very simple. If it's very low dose, then there's going to be very little effect on your health.
Dr. Edwin Lyman is the Director of Nuclear Power Safety at the Union of Concerned Scientists in Washington, D.C. I also interviewed him earlier. UCS is a notoriously anti-nuclear non-profit organization. Here's what he had to say on the linear no-threshold hypothesis. The linear no-threshold posits that the dose response in humans or animals to ionizing radiation is effectively linear. And as you well know, there is no solid scientific or statistical evidence below a certain threshold. It's been adopted, the linear no-threshold theory has been adopted as a precautionary principle by many scientific organizations. However, the UNSCAR has recently stated that multiplying infinitesimal doses by huge populations to estimate health impacts should not be done. What's your position on that?
Well, I don't think your statement that there's no scientific support for the linear no-threshold hypothesis is correct. The issue, as you know, is that in any statistical or epidemiological study, you are going to require a certain study size and a certain magnitude of effect to be able to demonstrate statistically significant effects. So the common understanding of ionizing radiation exposure comes in part from large epidemiological studies such as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki lifespan study, as well as other populations of people who are exposed with known and controlled exposures, which helps to be able to quantify the dose response. But you do have to extrapolate below the lowest dose where you can demonstrate a statistically significant effect, and there's an area of uncertainty. But there is a plausible biological mechanism to support a linear no-threshold hypothesis. And so, yes, the precautionary principle in terms of regulation would suggest that for those low doses, given you can extrapolate, you do have certain information by extrapolating from the higher dose range, and you can test different hypotheses for those lower doses. But couple that information with the plausible biological mechanisms, and it's quite a reasonable thing to posit. And the vast majority of radiation protection organizations and and scientists endorse the linear no threshold hypothesis. In the case of unskier statement, they don't provide any justification for why the notion of using collective dose is not a reasonable way to try to understand the health burden from ionizing radiation as a result of either routine or accidental exposures. They simply don't explain their justification.
And you say that there are plausible mechanisms. I think there are people that would disagree. And you say that you are working in facts as the UCS in your public policy stance. And I think assuming the linear no threshold theorem is not working in facts, the best scientific analysis, as you agree, are unable to measure any health effects of acute radiation exposures below, say, about 100 or maybe 50 millisieverts at the low end. And there's no evidence, as far as I'm aware, that populations living in enhanced natural radiation zones have elevated cancer rates. So I think maybe we'll have to agree to disagree on this point.
Dr. Blake Walters has a PhD in medical physics. He is an expert in radiation dosimetry and works with Canada's National Research Council developing computational techniques to greatly improve the accuracy of cancer radiotherapy. Here are his thoughts on the issue. What's your perspective on that from your background in this field?
It's bunk. I'm just kidding. It's no. I mean,
that's what I thought.
It has been largely. I think it's the evidence is in that this is a has been considered historically a conservative way of estimating. Keeping basically the principle you mentioned. I think was the. ALARA. ALARA, yeah. So as little as reasonably achievable. And
what that corresponds to is that makes nuclear technology as expensive as possible.
Right. It's that, and also the other thing that has resulted is what you might call costly overreactions to exposures that aren't dangerous at all. That in fact have little. I mean, if you look at the modeling, so the linear no threshold model. I mean, there are many convincing papers published recently that have debunked this, and not using particularly new ways of looking at the data, just actually looking at the data. And so I think the original linear no threshold. So basically, to sum up what linear no threshold says that any radiation is bad. That's what it's saying. So there's a finite risk, additional risk associated with any level of radiation. And the reality, and I think it's convincingly been shown, is that this is not true. And the problem is that when you go and start making policies and reputable organizations such as the International Council on Radiation Protection, its policy is based on the linear no threshold model. I mean, so it fits in the pocket of this ALARA principle, so as low as reasonably achievable. But I think what's lost in there is the R part, the reasonable part. No one wants to know that they're getting radiation. No one wants to think that they're getting unnecessary radiation. The reality is that we receive, significant doses of radiation every day or year. That, based on the linear no threshold model, would put us at significant risk. And this is background radiation from cosmic rays. This is radiation coming from our basements, radon, things like this. We have about somewhere between 1, depending on where you live on Earth, 1 and 260 millisieverts per year. It's a big range.
That's huge. Yeah.
It's huge, yeah.
260 is like radiation hot springs, I think.
It's actually in Iran. I think it's in the mountains in Iran. And there's a few hotspots on Earth.
Ramsar.
Yeah, Ramsar, exactly. There's Guangdong, China, and Kerala in India are also radiation hotspots. And in these places, there is no indication that there is increased incidence of cancer due to radiation.
That's important.
Yeah. And in fact, they've shown they've done a study where they look at what happens when they give people in these areas a dose of radiation, and they find that people who live in areas with high background radiation actually show a faster rate of cell repair after given what would be considered a damaging level of radiation. So
it's an adaptive response,
you
effectively,
have this idea,
which is completely nonlinear.
Right. So this is, they call this hormesis, I guess is the term that's used for kind of the cell's adaptive response to background radiation. We don't know why. It seems like there's actually, once you get down to a low enough level of radiation, you actually have negative risk associated with it. I don't know if anyone's come up with a single explanation, but one that's thrown out there is certainly that we have evolved with all beings on the planet have evolved with a level of background radiation that was probably greater than it is now.
It's true. All the radioactive stuff in the world has been decaying throughout the history of the world and getting less radioactive. So right now, it's the least radioactive time in the history of the world.
Yeah, but we're
this has been very interesting. So so if anyone comes up to you and tells you that there's no safe level of radiation, I'm looking at you, Greenpeace. You can tell them that Blake Walters tells you there is.
Yes, and I'll give them my phone number.
Excellent. It's a simple solution that is wrong, and the world is full of them.
Yeah, exactly. It's a simple, intuitive solution that's wrong.
So what does the data say? Well, in 2012, a historical cohort study of 175,000 patients without previous cancer who were examined with CT scans, so that's x-rays in your head basically, indicated that there was a linear dose response in the low dose region, so support for the LNT hypothesis. In 2013, a follow-up data linkage study of 11 million Australians with more than 680,000 people exposed to CT scans confirmed the results of the previous study in favor of LNT. However, this isn't a fait accompli. These results were disputed by a 2014 French study of 67,274 patients that took into account cancer predisposing factors among those scanned. So some of the people that were being medically scanned had predisposition to cancer. Not a surprise, because why else would you be being scanned? It concluded that taking these factors into account, there's no significant excess risk from CT scans of acquiring cancer. This also interestingly echoes political lines in both Australia and France. Australia bans nuclear power, and they support the LNT in their study. France gets over 70% of their electricity from nuclear power, and they found that the LNT was not supported by their work. An interesting coincidence. In 2016, Jeffrey A. Siegel summarized the debate between supporters and opponents of the linearno threshold hypothesis as based partially in conflict between statistical and experimental inference. Here's a quote that I really like from him. Epidemiological studies that claim to confirm LNT either neglect experimental and/or observational discoveries at the cellular, tissue, and organismal levels, or mention them only to distort or dismiss them. The appearance of validity in these studies rests on circular reasoning, cherry-picking, faulty experimental design, and/or misleading inferences from weak statistical evidence. In contrast, studies based on biological discoveries demonstrate the reality of hormesis, the stimulation of biological responses that defend the organism against damage from environmental agents. So it's an adaptive response. Sorry, that's an aside. Normal metabolic processes are far more damaging than all but the most extreme exposures to radiation. However, evolution has provided all extant plants and animals with defenses that repair such damage or remove the damaged cells, conferring on the organism even greater ability to defend against subsequent damage. Another thing to take into account in this debate is that the application of the LNT hypothesis has caused an irrational fear of radiation in the populace, and the observable effects of the fear of radiation from pushing this hypothesis or this extrapolation is significantly greater than the effects of anything these low doses of radiation could do. In fact, in the wake of the Chernobyl accident back in 1986, European-wide anxiety appeared in pregnant mothers because of their feeling from the LNT that their children would be born with mutations and birth defects. And so many of them went ahead and got induced abortions. And this was the single largest loss of life from the Chernobyl accident. There have been no measured germline mutations or effects on unborn children from the Chernobyl accident radiation. So the problem is we need to have a rational view of the effects of radiation and balance it out against other impacts on the organisms. Next up, we have Ed Lyman talking about hormesis.
Very interesting is that in studies, the potential health consequences of nuclear accidents, for instance, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission conducted a study called SORCA over the past decade, where they actually modeled to estimate the potential cancer fatalities resulting from severe accidents in nuclear power plants. And they looked at a range of assumptions in those models, including different thresholds. So they posited a 100 millirem, which is a 1 millisievert threshold, and also a 50 millisievert threshold, which is the assumption that you mentioned as far as the support from extrapolating from low doses. And the interesting thing is that even with those threshold assumptions, they only had a 10 or 20% effect on the overall cancer estimates of cancer fatalities, because most of the people exposed actually exceeded those thresholds.
Now, Ed mentions the SORCA report. SORCA was a study of very rare potential reactor accidents, like things with probabilities of less than 1 in a million years. Just to look at what could these impacts be and how could we prevent them. According to the SORCA report, the studies have shown that existing resources and procedures can stop an accident, slow it down, or reduce its impact before it can affect the public. Now, this study came out before the Fukushima accident. It says, but even if accidents proceed without such mitigation, they take much longer to happen and release much less radioactive material than earlier analyses suggested. Moreover, the analyzed accidents would cause essentially zero immediate deaths and only a very, very small increase in the risk of long-term cancer deaths. That's important. These are very rare accidents. And looking at the worst-case situations, 1 in a million years, there's not going to be essentially zero immediate deaths and very, very low risk of long-term deaths. Latent cancer fatality risk from the selected specific scenarios was found to be thousands of times lower than the NRC's own so-called safety goal, and millions of times lower than the general cancer fatality risk in the United States from all causes, even when employing the linearno threshold dose response model. So to talk a little bit more about the impacts of radioactive accidents at nuclear power plants, I'm going to replay a track from Dr. Phil Thomas, who has extensive experience in the chemical and nuclear industries and is a professor of risk management at University of Bristol. He is also the co-author of the famous NREFS study, which developed an objective method of risk assessment in nuclear accidents centered around a figure of merit he calls the J value, or judgment value. His research shows that the evacuations at Chernobyl and Fukushima were significantly overdone. The evacuations caused more harm than they prevented in terms of loss of life expectancy, average loss of life expectancy, which is what he uses to base his judgments on. His work shows that rare radiation-induced cancers typically show up later in life and do not have a significant effect on the average life expectancy, compared to the demonstrated damage done by removing people from their homes and support networks and putting them under enormous stress. Here's Dr. Thomas.
So I think there's enormous ignorance about the true, rather low effects of radiation in the quantities which we can reasonably expect ever to face, even after the worst, as you say, the worst nuclear accident ever. The worst nuclear accident ever was actually Chernobyl. We tell people our best knowledge. We try to place that knowledge in a way which people will understand. I don't think anyone understands, for instance, millisieverts as the effect of them. They have to translate that into something. At the moment, I think many of them translate it into something which is rather fuzzy. We can translate it. We and Walter Marshall before us could translate that into loss of life expectancy. That I think people can understand. To give you an example, we looked at the case of the food ban which had been in place in the UK for the whole of the 25 years from Chernobyl in 1986 to past Fukushima in 2011. It was only lifted in 2012. This is on lamb. This is on lamb, which was where the lamb was raised. The sheep were raised on hills in Wales and Scotland and Northern England. And because of the Chernobyl spread of low quantities of radioactivity across contamination right across Europe, had a very, very small effect, but it is, we calculate, for example, that the average UK citizen would have lost 4 hours to the fallout from Chernobyl. We have done that calculation. But they thought this would concentrate in lambs. We didn't do the calculation. We weren't set up to do the calculation in 1986, but we could actually do the calculations in 2012. And when we looked at that and found the residual risk was that if someone ate exclusively lamb produced, the most radioactive lamb produced on the most radioactive sheep that came down from the hills, and ate prodigious amounts of lamb. There couldn't be too many of such people, by the way, because there wasn't enough lamb, but nevertheless, if this happened, then that person might lose 4 hours of life expectancy.
Wow.
Now, and if it had been spread across the sort of consumption of the whole of the UK, the life expectancy lost would have been measured in microseconds.
That's on the order of walking by someone smoking a cigarette.
Yeah, I expect so. Yes, it's about of that order. Yes, exactly. And I mean, they are such palpably ludicrous figures that one comes up with, and I think people can look at that and say, well, gosh, no, that's too much. But that ban was actually kept in place when that was happening. Has now been lifted. But that's the sort of thing you can do. Again, irrespective of the J value, if you just work with life expectancy, it's an extremely powerful statistic.
Yeah, I think that the public is reacting to the actions of governments and believing that in a rational sense nuclear must be horrible because look, we're going to these polluted cities rather than staying put. So a rational person would see this action and interpret nuclear as being something must be being hidden from us. Yes. Because why would they evacuate us if there's no danger?
I think that's exactly right. In fact, the J value allows you to sort of have a sort of insight into what you have just said. It gives you another explanation for it, because it does say there is an equivalence between what people would ideally spend on safety and the amount of hazard which it's risk which it's taking away. And that and if you think of someone, I mean, if you think of the average person at Chernobyl who was seeing his government, I mean, the people around Chernobyl, they're not certainly weren't desperately prosperous, certainly not by Western standards, and they would have seen their government, which they found hadn't really taken too much notice of them before, but suddenly they were spending like it's no tomorrow. And I think exactly your thought, that they would think either that we're being saved from something terrible, or, and there's evidence for this, they thought, well, we're being paid huge amounts of compensation by the government, which is flailing around trying to keep us happy after the terrible fate that has now befallen us. And so we are now going to, our lives will have been foreshortened. We will die young, or certainly younger than we were when what we expected to be when we died. And the result of that, of course, is that a large section of that population then indulged in rather risky behavior as a result. We'll say, we've got nothing to lose. So yes, I think that's right. I think it is that message does go out to people.
Yeah, the lack of rigor in the response is more damaging than the accident itself. So based on all of this and your research into relative risks and how to judge them, I'd be interested to hear your opinion on nuclear energy going forward, knowing that there's a possibility of a further meltdown or nuclear accident, however slight. What's your opinion on nuclear energy in light of climate change concerns and fossil fuel burning and risks? How do you see this as is nuclear energy a solution for some of this, or should we be avoiding nuclear energy in the future?
No, I think it's necessary. I think it's the only concentrated form of energy production which can operate without producing carbon at the point of generation. So I think that, I mean, the renewables have their place, but they are intermittent. Wind, solar, they are both intermittent. But nuclear is a pretty safe and secure way of producing energy, and we do need that, to avoid the climate change that we are now all aware of, and there's evidence, very good evidence, that it is happening. So yes, nuclear is needed for that. I think that the nuclear industry still faces an existential threat. After Fukushima, Germany decided to move out of nuclear altogether. And Japan moved out of nuclear, at least temporarily, and is trying to restart its nuclear industry now. But I see no way for it to address that threat squarely unless it adopts the sort of methods that we have been using.
And now Dr. Jerry Thomas is going to come back and provide a fitting summary to this debate.
This argument about, what the shape is at the lower end of the level of dose, is it concave or a convex curve? Is it hormesis or not? To me, is actually quite a sterile argument, because the effects of those doses of radiation are minuscule in comparison with things like obesity, alcohol, smoking, stress. In terms of increasing your risk of cancer, low doses of radiation pale into its significance when it comes to looking at those things. So to me, I don't actually care what it looks like at the bottom end of the curve, because there are things that are much more powerful in driving cancer as a public health issue.
Yes.
that are nothing to do with radiation and everything to do with actually lifestyle and how we abuse our bodies ourselves. And unfortunately, people think that if there's a nuclear accident like in Chernobyl or Fukushima, then it's very high dosage levels to the population. And that's just not true.
Thank you so much for listening to The Rational View. If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.